talking with God about kings and kingdoms. 2 Samuel chapter 10 this week is to kill a mockingbird. Come on in, let's check it out.
All the Bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical Channel. Just trying to get people from the bullshit to the holy shit so that you can shoot the shit and know your shit and actually just have a confidence in God that just wrings the chamois of life out the way it was meant to be. Yes, indeed, living out the godly life is fun and exciting, and God has put together the best novel of all time. So that is what we're trying to do here. We just want to rejoice always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances, because that's the will of God for your life. Everything else is just this broken world, and we need to make sense in this broken world, and that's what God is desperately trying to get you to do. Start calling me Dad. Start thinking of me as Dad. Start trusting in me, loving in me. Life goes a whole lot better this way. We're convinced that we can all do it together here, and that's what God would have us to do. Anywho, chapter 10 of 2 Samuel, that's where we are. The whole series is designed to, really capture what God is doing, and that is we're talking to God about kings and kingdoms. So there was all kinds of life nuggets in these storylines, and today's talk is entitled To Kill a Mockingbird, because the story is going to be about mocking guys and cutting off their beards, or at least half of their beards, and also cutting their garments up above their waist. So anyhow, I can't help but to, think about Harper Lee and her fantastic novel, but also can't help but to think that the Bible is a great novel. It's a novel unlike anything else we could ever possibly imagine. It's a novel that spans, writers from Moses the whole way to, the Apostle John. And everybody in between is part of the faithful community that God chooses to put together his novel. So most of the authors of the biblical text, like our 2 Samuel here, we really don't know the authors, because the authors are all trying to just put God at the center. God is the hero of this story, but God is also the writer of this story. They're just playing their parts. They're just playing it out like God laid it out, and it's up to us to kind of catch the vibe and ride the wave that God is providing to us and have some fun in doing so. And God seems to be very familiar with the way the world works. And anyhow, so hats off to Harper Lee and her book, To Kill a Mockingbird. Fantastic book. And I do believe that I just read in a headline that there's some more stuff being released. She's been dead for about 10 years now. Not quite, but, she's got some new stuff being released from the archives. Anyhow, that's good. God, though, has the bestseller. And, whether people like it or not, the Bible's a bestseller. And if you read it right, it is so much fun. And God has a lot of fun with human history and telling his own story the way he wants to. And it has lots of surprises and lots of foreshadowings that, is the substance of great novels. So, Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is in the setting of God has fulfilled his promise. The promise that he made to Abraham has now come to fruition. He can be trusted, and Israel is now sitting in a sweet spot where they have God at their side. Well, actually, God in the front, and God has promised that if Israel obeys God's voice, well, then he will always protect them. He will always make sure that everything goes right, and any enemies of Israel will have to face his consequences. And that's kind of what's going on here. Last chapter, we talked about, the Psalm 2 fulfillment, the Psalm 2 perspective that God has on this world, that God, has put a nation among nations, and God has a king among kings. And the reality is that God's nation among nations and king among kings is the only one that we ought to be paying attention to. So for right now, in 1000 BC, so 3,000 years ago, David is sitting on top of the God story. He is the king that God really did have in mind from the tribe of Judah. All things are now set in motion to, go forward. Yay is kind of the big chant. And this is the last of the crescendo or the apex chapters. From here on out, the wheels of the bus are going to get wobblier and wobblier for Israel because they just can't keep up their end of the bargain. God always keeps up his end of the bargain. Even though Israel will lose the plot, God's plot thickens and gets even better. So that's what we want to see in this chapter. So let's just look at life in 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago. David is king. And I think this story is just a representative kind of story that, this is the behavior that David knew that as king, God's king, that he was to put forward. His plan is to bring a blessing to the Ammonites who have lost their, king. And so the king's son has now taken over, Hanun. And so David sends an entourage of covenant. He sends an entourage of blessing to comfort, the Ammonites who have lost a dear leader of theirs. And so David is behaving very well. David is behaving like a leader. David is behaving like a godly man. He is intentionally trying to bring good relationships to the nations and the tribes and this, and all of the, smaller kingdoms around him. He's doing his part the way he should. But he lives in a wicked world, and we're going to see that his good intentions are going to fall flat hard. And just the way this world, generally does, it doesn't matter how good your intentions, if there is a cognitive dissonance or if there is a confirmation bias to be had, it will throw up a wall that will spoil the best of efforts. So, Hanun, seems to receive David's delegation fairly well until Hanun's men say, "Are you kidding me? David hates you, and the Israelites hate us, and all they're doing is spying on us." And that gets into Hanun's head. And one of the the great verses comes out in verse 6 when it says, "The Ammonites then saw that they had become a stench to David." Well, they did, they saw that they had become a stench to David is a perversion of their own ears and their own eyes, because they should not have seen that they became a stench to David, because they are not a stench to David. David was doing a good thing by sending this, delegation of comfort and mourning to give honor to the Ammonites and to bring blessing to the Ammonites as well, to bring restoration and reconciliation, this kind of stuff. They have twisted this into an evil plot, and that's just what humans do. Humans ruin most good things, especially when humans have their own confirmation biases, and whenever they have their own cognitive dissonances, they're usually based upon their own tribal perspective, their own insecurities, etc., etc. So the leadership team around Hanun, the Ammonite, gets into his head, and he decides that he is going to shave off half the beards of David's men, which is hilarious, right? I mean, that's just a funny move. And then beyond that, he cuts their garments, above the waist, so the privates are showing. And then he sends them out. So this is an act of humiliation. This is, I suppose it's better than killing them, but it is still an act of humiliation that sends a very clear message to David that, hey, we hate you and we don't accept your BS. David's like, are you kidding me? This was not BS. But that's the way the world turns. And so this perversion of seeing what you want to see instead of really examining something for what it actually is, so someone comes in peace and offers you something and then you turn it into a nightmare. How many times have you seen that played out, in different ways, in different shapes? Maybe it's you even that have done that at times where you've completely misunderstood the lay of the land. This is one of those scenes. God is putting together a story to show us that he understands human beings very well. And that is part of God's, intention here is for you to understand humans very well. Okay, so It's, well, a different reaction now, because now the humiliated men of David come back with half beards, with half beards and garments now that don't cover their private parts. And so this great act of humiliation, David sends them off to rest up, grow their beards back, and sew up some new garments. But this requires an action in response now. And the required reaction is typical of this world. It now, requires, that David assemble the military around Joab. Joab is the military leader. But in this, we get a little picture of Joab and his brother Abishai. And Joab and Abishai have a great quote in verse 12, be of good courage, let us be of courage for our people, for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him. So this is a good, verse to kind of hone in on, because Joab's character has already been suspect, thus far, and Joab's character will get even more suspect down the road. David's character will get more suspect down the road. Remember that Joab was the one who took vengeance into his own hands against the death of his brother. He had, a similar problem where he could not see reality, and now the tables, Joab is still part of this, but in the face of this, Joab does understand that he is to be working on God's behalf, that God is the one who has to go before them. It is God who will do what is good for them. So basically, Joab and Abishai are surrounded by the mercenary armies that King Hanun has hired out, with the Syrians. They are surrounded, and Joab just tells Abishai, well, if you're not doing well, holler out for help. If I'm not doing well, I'll holler out for help, and we will see what God does with this, which is just a great little picture of their trust in God. And once again, the Bible does not allow us to really worship the characters in the Bible, because they're all fallen characters just doing their best. And part of that picture that we're supposed to see is that you could do better than these guys. And even though these guys are fallen in so many ways, God is still going to redeem them, and this is the nature of our God. He redeems all of us. All of us are sinners, we are told. Every single human on the planet is a sinner and fallen short of the glory of God. And that message comes through time and time and time and time again, that the characters are not there for us to worship. God is there for us to worship. And it is astounding to see that God is patient, and nothing can ruin God's plans. Even the efforts of some pretty squirrely characters cannot derail God and his plot in his story that he is putting together. So, as it turns out, Joab and Abishai, find victory in this what seems to be impossible situation, because God is with them. And again, this is the mounting, evidence that we are given in this real section of history, which, this is a reality of history. This is not some made up fabrication of history. These, areas and places exist, and these people existed in a real time, in a real way. This is no, this is no fantasy characterization of people. This is the real people that we know. Joab and Abishai are kind of and also the, Hanun, that character. All these characters are just like characters that we meet and see in the world around us in some way, shape, or form. So, Joab, David, Israel at this point, they're on their A game and they're doing well. And God does come to their rescue. It is God really who does the defeating, because God is on their side. This is his kingdom. This is his story. And at this point, everybody is acting out of good faith. And so God is going to stand behind them, and he is going to use the world's tactics that they use. So, it's funny how we get upset in the old part of the Bible when God uses the tactics that we do. We have this perverted, twisted sense, that, well, we can do it, but God can't. And God doing it is actually part of the message that this isn't really his way, but he will operate in our ways. He will, operate in our ways for the sake of us learning lessons from history. And so at this point, the big lesson is that God is going to keep his promise, and God is going to protect his kingdom here as long as they are faithful. If they are not going to be faithful, if Israel's not going to be faithful, if the kings of Israel are not going to be faithful, then God will have to remove them from this land. And that is exactly what happens, in another 500 years. God is very patient. He's very kind. And he, tarries on with Israel for another 500 years. But that is going to happen. The wheels of the bus will slowly come off. And that sets up a new chapter in the story that is going to take place. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But for right now, the other good thing that happens in this is that when Joab and Abishai defeat the Syrians who have been hired out by Hanan, the other kingdoms around take notice and they say, you know what? We're going to make peace. So this king Hadazer, he's one of those guys around. He sees that, Israel is a force to be reckoned with. And so Hadazer says, man, we want to make peace and alliances with you, which is what David was trying to do with Hanan from the very beginning. It is Hanan that brought this misery on himself and his people and the Syrian people. And so, the correct perspective is to, follow the pattern of Psalm 2, and that is to find the son that God has picked. In this case, it is David right now, and kiss his ring and make peace, because that's going to be good for you. And it is good for them. So anyhow, this world, though, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at the ways of this world and how this world will always need force to go along with, any kind of goodness. Because this world is perverted and it's twisted and it is full of confirmation biases and cognitive dissonances. And so this world is always going to need force. There will always have to be sticks that go along with the carrots. The people in this world that pretend like the world can be run on carrots alone are absolutely nuts. They are disconnected from reality. God is at pains to show us in this storyline that as long as this world exists the way it is, there will always be this need for sticks to go along with the carrots. Sorry, but it is real and it is reality. And God's the only one speaking truth. There are so many people around us today that just try to ignore this truth. I served as an 8th grade English teacher in a middle school. And I saw the inside. I did this for 12 years, and I saw how messed up the well-meaning teaching community is in thinking that they can only run a school on carrots and no sticks. And then the wider world around us, our government, at every level is always pretending like it can run the world on carrots and not sticks. But then we also see that it doesn't really, and it ends up punishing. It gets very messed up in a hurry. So God is very aware of the messed up nature to this world, but he is happy to play along because this is the way we seem to want it. The only way to really have a stick-free world is to put our trust in God and God alone. Because he will be the one who bears the stick only, and he will take the stick even upon himself. And so when I come to this story, a really funny story, because the whole thing about cutting these guys' garments above the waist and cutting off half of their beards in an act to humiliate them is interesting to me, because as God turns the page in Israel's life, he seems to be fixated, like a good writer is, on the funny events of the past or the events of the past that continue on in the story. And here's what I mean by that. The thing that makes the Bible truly unreal to us and unbelievable to us is that it is a story that spans the lifetime of many, many, many generations of people. And so here we are seeing, David and what is going on in David's life as really the fulfillment of a promise that God had made to a obscure character named Abraham, and how this obscure people of Abraham have become a multitude of people, and then enslaved by Israel, and that God is their rescuer, and God is going to make them into a people for himself, a treasured possession, a people that he loves, a people that he is calling to trust on them so that the world can see that God is trustworthy. Okay? This isn't the end of the story. It's really, in some ways, only the beginning of the story, because part of God's ambition in this part of the story is for us to see that the ways of this world really don't work. So, and the ways of this world are not God's ways, they're our ways. And so this scene is interesting, the bearded scene, the killing of the bearded, mockers, is what I see, that those who shaved the beard and mocked, are going to face the punishment of God. But this is interesting because down the road 500 years, in 350 years, a prophet named Isaiah and the prophets around Isaiah begin to receive new information from God on how the story is going to go. And the story is going to still involve God's king and God's man, God's chosen one, his Messiah. But there's new information that is just beyond Israel's belief. And that this king, this future king, or this future anointed Messiah, the Savior of Israel, in Isaiah chapter 50, is a suffering servant. And that's what, makes the biblical story, the God-given story, so fascinating, is that the true ending of the story is not in the ways of this world, where might, has to be combined with what is right. And in the prophetic community of Isaiah introduces new information, a new character, that this new Savior, that God is promising, because he's going to keep his promise to Israel. He is going to make them the great nation that he wants them to be, but he's also going to include all of the other nations, emerges as what we call the suffering servant. And so the suffering servant in Isaiah 42, 49, 50, 52, and 53 starts to give shape to what Israel should be looking for down the road. And so in this, Isaiah chapter 50, verse 4, is just a section, but it involves a beard. So this is just great writing, and the only way for this great writing to really take shape is by God's own hand. He's got to give the story, because it's no coincidence that there is a beard, And anyhow, let me just read you Isaiah chapter 50, verse 4, which is this new picture of the new leader that God has intended to rescue and save Israel. And here are the words. The Lord has given me, so this is that servant speaking, the Lord has given me the tongue of those who are taught, that I may know how to sustain with a word him who is weary. Morning by morning he awakens me, he awakens my ear to hear as those who are taught. The Lord has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious. I turned not backward. I gave my back to those who would strike, and my cheeks to those who would pull out the beard. Isn't that funny? I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting, but the Lord helps me. Therefore I have not been disgraced. You see, if the Lord is the one behind you, there is no disgrace for you, no matter what the world does to try to disgrace you. And this character embodies the true Spirit of God. that indeed the Lord helps me, and therefore I'm not disgraced. But the world is still a world who insists on striking us and insists on pulling out the beard. So, of course, spoiler alert, this is Jesus. Jesus is the suffering servant. Jesus is the one who, when he came, the world did not recognize because he was a suffering servant. He allowed the world around him to spit on him, to disgrace him, and to pull out his beard. Flash forward when Jesus is talking to his own disciples, Mark chapter 10, verse 32. The disciples are on the road going to Jerusalem. Jesus is ahead of them. They are amazed, and those who followed were actually afraid. And taking the 12 again, Jesus told them what was going to happen. And he said, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man," talking about himself, "will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And in 3 days he will rise." Jesus is the suffering servant. Jesus was telling the apostles that he is the suffering servant. Rather than responding to the mocking world, the world that pulls out beards, the world that cuts off our garments and laughs and mocks, he will allow that to happen because God is with him. In fact, the truly wonderful thing of the story is God. And that's hilarious because God has the character that he allows himself to be disgraced by us in our ways. We're the ones who think that might makes right. God is the only one who has true might, which makes us a joke. We are the mocking birds. And Jesus is the one whose beard was pulled out, and Jesus is the one who was spit upon. All along, as he in his mind, he knew that he would raise from the grave to defeat the true enemy, which is sin and death. And this, my friends, is the story of God, which gives meaning to the mocking that David's men suffered and the retaliation that then was supposedly necessary. But here God really steps in. And when God steps in, he takes the mocking birds or the mocking beards of our society, including us. And he brings it upon himself in his own death. And he shows his power not by retaliation, but by rising from the dead. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our leader. And this is the only kind of leader like this. Jesus Christ, God himself, is the only kind of leader that can get us beyond sin and death. And that is the way God rolls out his story. We'll catch you next time.